I'd like to engage you in thinking about the last 113 years and the next 37 years, the time frame of 150 years from 1900 to 2050. How's the world done? Cambridge University Press, my publisher, cleverly superimposed these two pictures, a Polish city from 1900, and in the background you see these very futuristic buildings that could have been built in 2050. They're actually being built right now in South Korea. And they emphasize the immense change, an amazing change that's happened in that 150-year period. I've asked 21 of the world's top economists to tell us how much have global problems cost the world from 1900 and to 2050. We're looking across a wide range of different areas, anywhere from air pollution and armed conflicts to malnutrition and water and sanitation. I think everyone would agree, yes, these are some of the big issues of the world. They're not all of the issues, but they're definitely a huge part of them. And I'd like to share with you how have we been doing across all these areas. Let me just get right into it. In some ways, you could say the biggest issue is human health. Sure, it's incredibly important to have great education or have a great environment, but if you're dead, it kind of doesn't matter. So let's take a look at human health. In 1900, the average person on this planet lived to be 32 years of age. 32 years! Today, that number is up to 67 years. Over the past 113 years, we've more than doubled our life expectancy on this planet. By 2050, we expect it to be up to 76 years. That's a dramatic increase. And I think we fail to understand how amazing this is. Every month you live extra, our health system actually buys you an extra week. Isn't that amazing? Over the last couple of decades, for every decade we've lived longer, we've actually added 2.5 years to our life expectancy. To a large extent, this is of course because we've dealt with some of the big problems in the world. We've eradicated smallpox, arguably the biggest killer in human history. It probably killed from 1900 to 1979 400 million people, about 3 times the number of people that died in all the wars of the 20th century and all the major calamities of the 20th century. And in 1979, we eradicated smallpox. So 400 million people died, is now gone. Likewise, immunization, one of the things we don't think very much about. In 1970, only 1 in 20 kids were immunized, typically rich world kids, against measles and whooping cough and a lot of other terrible diseases because of a unique cooperation between World Health Organization, UNICEF, the World Bank, and aided by the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. In 2000, just 30 years later, we had 85% of all kids in the world immunized, saving about 3 million lives each year. Those are some of the amazing stories in human health, but I want to show you how we can translate this into something that we can then compare using economics. So let's try and take a look at what is the impact, how much has the lack of human health cost the world? Well, in 1900, the average person produced $1,200 per year. If you died, that was money the world didn't get. So take all those years we died, because we already died at 32 on average, and multiply it by all the people who died, and compare it to the total world production in 1900. And the answer is 32% of global world product was lost because of bad human health. It gives you a sense of proportion. And what it also does, it enables us to show what's the development across the century and a half. Today, that number is down to about 10%, and in 2050 we expect it to be about 5%. Of course, we are much richer and we value our lives much more, but at the same time we also lose many fewer life years, which is why it's gone down dramatically. The amazing opportunity of doing this is, of course, now we can start comparing human health to all the other challenges that the world face. Let's take, for instance, education, obviously a huge issue that has great impact. And I think, some of the things that we don't even have a sense of. Back in 1900, the average person on the planet had about 1 year of schooling. Today, that number is about 8 years, and in 2050, it'll be about 10 years. So to the ones of you who are still in school, sorry, you guys are going to stay longer in school. But the reality, of course, is that this has had a huge impact on human life quality. Take just illiteracy, which is how we measure the impact of lack of education. In 1900, we estimate that about 70% of all people in the world were illiterate. They just couldn't read and write. Yes, in Western Europe and the US, it was probably only 16%. But just go to Eastern Europe and Russia, it was probably 75%. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it was 94% that were illiterate. Today, that number is 20%. Yes, most kids get to learn to read and write, but there's still a legacy of adults that still don't read. And even in 2050, we still expect about 12% illiteracy. This has a huge impact. Take, for instance, Pakistan and South Korea. In 1950, they're about equal both on GDP and on schooling. But since then, South Korea has zoomed off. They basically have 12 years of great education now, and their GDP has increased 23-fold. At the same time, Pakistan is struggling to just get 6 years of education, not a very good one at that, and their GDP per capita has only increased 3-fold. So if we take the total cost again and look at how much has that cost, the fact that we have been illiterate, that 70% were illiterate in 1900, the cost was about 12% of global world product. Since then, it's declined, so it's now down to about 7%. And in 2050, we expect it to be down to about 4%. Likewise, with malnutrition, one of the oldest scourges of the world, there's still about 1 billion people that don't get enough food. And we don't know how to measure how much food people got back in 1900, but the researchers then did something ingenious because they know how tall you were. And tall is very well correlated to how well you were fed when you grow up. If you're tall, chances are you didn't suffer from malnutrition. If you're short, there's a much greater chance that you were stunted as a child. And actually, over the last 113 years, the average height in the developing countries have grown about 5 centimeters, or 2 inches. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's the difference for a lot of people between being malnourished and not. So if we again look at what was the impact in 1900, it was about 11% that we lost because of malnutrition. Today, that number is down to about 6.7%. In 2050, it'll be down to 5%. You probably also see the slight curve up, which is unlike some of the other curves we see. That's basically because the West, especially the US, fixed malnutrition around the Second World War, rest of Europe and Russia probably towards the end of last century. But many in the developing world are only starting now, Latin America a little bit later, Southeast Asia, and Africa, unfortunately, last. These are some of the obvious things. Yes, we live longer, we have better education, we have less malnutrition. Let me also show you 3 of the surprising ones that we don't often think about. Gender inequality, for instance. Gender inequality essentially means that because a lot of women are not out in the workplace, we're essentially letting go of almost half the world's population. That's a terrible misuse. In a sense, you could say in 1900, only 15% of the global workforce were women. Even now, it's a 40%, not an equal 50%. And even by 2050, we still think it'll only be at 45%. Not only that, women also get paid less than men. In 1900, they probably only got paid about 50% of what men get paid. In 2050, it'll still not be equal at 70%. If we could get more equality, it would not only mean higher production because we'd have many more people working, but we would also have more productive people working. Of course, there is some unfinished work. There's unpaid work that has to be done by either man or women in the household, and we take that into account when we account for this, and we'd also need more education. We also take that into account. The economists both looked at the possibility of a radical equalization, essentially eradicating all gender inequality, but I'm going to show you what they call the moderate version, eradicating half of all inequality. So remember, these curves could actually be argued to be even worse than what I'm going to show you. But if you look at what the impact is, the cost of not having gender equality in 1900 was probably about 17%. Since then, it's declined because we've got more women in the workforce and they're paid better, but still not well enough, down to 7% now, and it'll decline further to 5% by mid-century. Let me also show you 2 environmental issues that we often talk about. Let me first show you global warming. This is obviously an issue that we talk a lot about. It's definitely a real issue. It's man-made. It is an important problem. It's something we need to fix. But if you look at the time period from 1900 to 2050, surprisingly for a lot of people, the net impact of most global warming was actually positive. That's because CO2 is actually fertilizer. That means it increases our agricultural production. Of course, in the long run, increasing temperature is also going to reduce agricultural production. We're also seeing more people die from heat, but many more people will avoid to die from cold, again with moderate global warming. And we probably also see lower costs of heating outweigh the extra cost of cooling. So actually, if you look at what the cost is, it turns out to be a slight negative, around 1900, probably 0.5%, and across the whole of the century, mostly a negative. This is a very, very small one, so let me just enlarge that so it's a little clearer to see. But again, if you look here in 2013, the cost of global warming is probably minus 1.3%, or to put it differently, it's actually a positive of 1.3%. Notice towards the end of the graph, outside of our period, it actually turns up. And around 2070, global warming becomes a net problem for the world, and it'll become a problem in 1 or 2% towards 2100, which is still why it's a problem, which we still need to fix it. But it's actually mostly a benefit in the 20th and 21st century. And the last one I want to show you is another environmental problem which we talk a lot less about, but which we probably should talk a lot more about: air pollution. Now, a lot of people would think I should have shown a picture of air pollution like smokestack or a car exhaust, and that's certainly how we think in the first world about air pollution. But actually, that's only about 1/5 of total air pollution. Outdoor air pollution is a big problem, probably killed about 65 million people in the 20th century. But it is a very small part of the total impact. It's gotten better in first world countries because we've gotten, through the environmental movement in the 70s, actually reduced the emissions, but it's gotten worse in many third world cities. You know, the Beijings of the world, air pollution is actually getting worse and worse. But a much bigger problem of air pollution is actually indoor air pollution. Most people in this world don't have access to energy, and they certainly don't have access to keeping warm and cooking, so they use bad fuels. About 3.2 billion people use twigs, cardboard, and dung to keep warm and cook. And that has probably, in the 20th century, killed about 260 million people, twice as many as died in all the wars and calamities of the 20th century. And that has gone down dramatically. That's why I'm showing this picture of a market in Ghana, where there's virtually no light, and where everybody are using really polluting energy sources. Actually, and surprisingly, most homes in third world countries are about 10 times more polluted than the worst outdoor pollution that you see in Beijing and other places. So if you want to get clean air in the third world, you should go outside. So the reality here is, if you look at how much air pollution has cost, in 1900, the cost was about 23%. It's since then declined dramatically to 6% now and 4% in 2050. So let me get back to that question of how's the world doing. We've seen the picture, 1900, 2050. How have we done? Obviously, there's a lot of double counting in many of these things, and triple counting. If you count people that die from air pollution, they'll probably also turn out in health. If you look at people who don't have enough education, they're probably also going to be malnourished. But what we hope is that all of these are probably on the same range across time, so we can actually add them up. We can't really, but if you promise not to show anyone or tell anyone, I'm actually going to show you what would happen if we added all of them up. There's a couple of them I haven't told you about. Biodiversity. Across the 20th century, we cut down a lot of forests. We caused a lot of damage to biodiversity. Probably cost about 1% of GDP in most of the 20th century. In the 21st, we actually estimate a slight positive because we're getting rich enough. We're starting reforesting and so on. If you look at global warming, again, as I mentioned, it's probably a slight positive, but again, it also is down there just around zero. If we take a look at some of the really big impacts, air pollution, as we talked about, a really big impact that has declined dramatically over the 150-year time frame. Education, likewise. Gender inequality. Surprisingly to a lot of people, water and sanitation is a very small part. It actually accords fairly well with the global burden of disease study that indicates that water and sanitation is much, much less lethal than we typically thought. But it also shows the same decline over the last 150 years. And obviously human health, by far the biggest impact here, and then malnutrition. The two last ones that I haven't talked about is trade barriers. We actually started out the 1900s with pretty free trade, but then of course came the First World War and basically broke down everything, the Great Depression in the 30s, and since then we've been struggling to get back. One of the opportunities of free trade is not only to be able to get rich in the First World, but especially to get rich in the Third World, and we've still some ways to go. The last one is conflicts, armed conflicts. Again, we started out very, very low, but very quickly, of course, we screwed that up with First and Second World War, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. But actually, if you notice, it's declined since then. So we've seen the same picture as we've seen for the other outcomes. So if you look across all of this, and again remember, there's lots of double and triple counting, but we assume that it's probably in the same order across all of this time period, what you see is it's about 100% of global world product. Obviously, there's no reason why it should be exactly 100%. It could have been 200, it could have been 50. It's really just an indication of a counterfactual of how much it would have cost had we had the opportunity to do a lot better. But in reality, what has happened is over the past 113 years till today, it's gone down dramatically to about 40%. And we actually estimate by 2050 we'll be down to around 27%. So getting back and answering the question, how has the world done over the past 150-year time frame? We are doing a lot better. It doesn't mean we can just relax. There's still lots and lots of problems, as we can see: air pollution, education, gender inequality, human health, malnutrition. But now we can both realize things are getting better, and we can also start making sure that when we work to make a better world tomorrow, we focus on the problems that matter the most. So thank you very much.